Suriname has 8 days of paid leave. The only other Caribbean country in the mix with paternity leave, Mr. President, as a matter of legislation, when I say Caribbean, I mean CARICOM country, is Suriname. No other CARICOM country has a paid paternity leave. Prime Minister says to us all the time, Barbados must not be afraid to lead. On the matter of paternity leave in the Caribbean, Barbados has not been afraid to lead. Mr. President, there are a handful, and I've already cited who they are, and the ILO has a report, ILO ECLAC report, it's called Time for Care Bulletin, and it talks about, and this is the information that I'm drawing this from, Mr. President, so it outlines where this information can be found if anyone is interested in finding it. So, I am satisfied, Mr. President, that Barbados is playing in a space where we have an expenditure that is associated with maternity leave benefits as it currently stands, extending that maternity leave for an additional period, as I will get to in the bill, and then further extending that, Mr. President, to the fathers by introducing for the first time paternity leave. That developed countries with trillion-dollar economies have introduced this and have the wherewithal in their national insurance schemes and systems, however they're structured, to be able to make these payments will not create an equivalence for Barbados with a much smaller economy. But it means that we have the ability to make the commitment for a social policy reason, Mr. President, and to commit to the investments in family. That brings me then to what the legislation itself has set out to do. The legislation sets out to do a few things, Mr. President. In the first place, it focuses on the mother, the paternity, maternity benefits. And so I'm going to speak to what we have in clause 4, the grant of maternity leave to employees. In the first instance, Mr. President, it replaces the Employment of Women Maternity Leave Act, Cap 345A, with this particular piece of legislation. And of course, there are going to be consequential amendments that will come to the NISS Act, which we would have passed, Cap 47, and a series of regulations arising therefrom, and then also in the Prevention of Employment Discrimination Act of 2020. These are all things that were announced in the budgetary statement of June of 2025 by the minister with responsibility for finance in the Ministry of Finance. And he announced at the time that we would introduce this measure. The bill then moves to extend maternity leave from what I had when my daughter was born, 12 weeks, 3 months, to 14 weeks for a single birth. If a mother has a baby, a single baby, then she is able to go off on maternity leave no more for 12 weeks, but for 14 weeks. And I have already shared upfront what the cost of that has been to the National Insurance Scheme. And I always say to people, I find myself sitting and talking to people a lot and trying to explain government policy, because I realize a lot of times that government and governance are not things that obviously they're not taught in schools, they're not interacting with it. If you're not a part of the process, you don't necessarily realize that A connects to B, to C, to D, to E, and it has a direct correlation on the things that you think you want but don't realize what it costs. I deliberately wanted to share what it costs the state, and in particular, the National Insurance Scheme, to make sure that as it currently stands at 12 weeks, we are able to extend these benefits. If we were to then combine, Mr. President, as we do now, the further extension of 14 weeks to mothers, the provision, Mr. President, in the legislation for additional leave captured in clause 8.1, where in the event that something has happened and there's the recommendation from a medical professional that the mother has complications of some kind, then those cases allow for extended leave. If there is a complication of the baby, where the child needs additional medical care, anybody who has had a preemie, anybody who has had a baby with medical issues, who has to spend their time or wants to be close to their baby in the hospital, is going to be therefore eligible for this additional leave on the basis of advice from a medical professional. And this is captured, Mr. President, in the additional leave section, section 8, clause 8.1 of the legislation. Then it goes on, Mr. President, to introduce the newness that I mentioned before. 3 weeks given to fathers. 3 weeks given to fathers in addition to their annual holiday to be able to be a part of that early, very precious time to spend with your newborn and to support the mother. The legislation then covers that in clause 5.1. In clause 5.1, it says that the father is required to provide a couple of pieces of documentation. In the first instance, clause 5.1a, a certificate issued by a medical practitioner setting forth the expected date of birth of the child, and then secondly, a certificate issued by a medical practitioner or a midwife setting forth the actual date of the birth of the child. But then there are some additional things, because if you're a mother, there can be no ambiguity that you've given birth. If you're a father, you then want to make sure that you're clear that you are the one whose child has been born. And so the legislation acknowledges that practicality. The legislation then says that where you are the father, you have a couple of additional things that you need to provide, including a note from the mother saying you are daddy, right? So that is a fairly simple requirement that is expected to come about there, because the legislation recognizes that mothers and fathers need to be a part of that child's life. Then it talks about the protection for parents, Mr. President. That is captured in the legislation at clause 9.1. And I want to park there for a moment, perhaps to go back to where I started. The legislation covers a couple of things. One, during the time that you are on maternity leave, during the time that you are on paternity leave, approved, employers are not allowed to dismiss or to give you notice of a dismissal at any time during that period, or even under the additional leave that I have covered under Section 8. You are not allowed to give notice of a dismissal to an employee so that it would expire during the time of maternity leave, not when she's pregnant, not when you're asking her to resign during that time of pregnancy, and you're not meant to force a person to resign. Then it goes on in clause 9.1.2 to speak also about what happens during the paternity leave period. The same thing happens here. And then subsections 1 and 2 would not apply, obviously, where there are exemptions, where there has been a serious misconduct or gross negligence amounting to abandonment of duty on the part of the employee, and then it lists those kinds of things. I want to take a moment then also to go to clause 10.1, protection of seniority rights, because this is where I wanted to land when I made a reference to when I went back to work. Where a female employee has been granted maternity leave under the Act, when she goes back to work after baby has had the benefit of mother and father, and mom goes back to work, she cannot be denied her seniority rights. She cannot be denied the ability to be reinstated in her former work or equivalent work. And she shall not, by reason only of the fact that she went on maternity leave, be paid a lower remuneration than what she was paid before she went off. Her vacation days, her sick days, and her any entitled leave remain her entitlements, any training or promotion on resumption of duties. And the same thing applies in the case of paternity leave. Now, Mr. President, I wanted to point those sections out because those are matters which are legislated. Those are things which are already covered in employment rights law. But you know, in all instances in life, there are the hard things and then there are the soft things. And I remember when we talk about, we talk about gender policy, we talk about equal rights for women, equal employment, and so on, there are those hard things that can be legislated. But then there are those mindset things that we probably also need to attempt in softer policy, moral suasion, but also in speaking to employers to address. I, as a woman, have always made it clear, you cannot make decisions for me. You cannot determine what I can or cannot do because I have a young child. If I am entitled or if I am next in line to go off on training, if I am next in line to go off on mission, if I am next in line to go off to take on additional responsibilities, you cannot decide she got a young child home, she ain't gonna be able to give this amount of time and effort to the job or to the responsibility or to the task at hand. So you pass that mother over in favor of somebody else because you have made a decision that she has other responsibilities that are not yours. That's not your place. That's not your place. You as an employer cannot, and I don't mean just an employer, supervisors, managers, CEOs, persons in authority over other persons. It doesn't have to be the big boss or the company owner. It oftentimes it will be persons who are in positions of authority. You cannot make decisions for other women because they have taken on the role of motherhood. You cannot take on responsibilities for other women or other men who have now been coming back off of paternity leave. Oh, he can't work late, he got a young child. That's not your decision to make. Tell me, as the employee, what you want me to do because it fits under my remit. Let me decide if I can do it. If I cannot do it, I will say so. But it is not your decision to make. And this legislation speaks to the hard things, but we also need to be able to create the culture and the mindset and to socialize people, especially males who like to make decisions for women. I will make my own decisions. And I see the men in the chamber looking at me, and I'm not even looking up at you all. Deliberately. But for the hard things which can be legislated, there is an enforcement provision in this legislation. And this enforcement provision speaks about you can find it in clause 10, I spoke about it before, but also clause 11, where it puts the remit under the Chief Labor Office to be able to adjudicate in the event and to levy fines if they are found to be guilty. There are a number of consequential amendments that obviously then have to be made to the National Insurance Act, as I mentioned before, Cap 47, and the benefit regulations of 1967 to be able to bring the bill into effect, and this will allow the family leave bill to be fully implemented. So I've gone through the legislation, Mr. President. I have gone through the policy objectives, Mr. President. I have also started out by looking at the cost of taking these measures, Mr. President. And so I want to make the following points as a matter of policy now. This is a government that has invested significant resources in family policy. This is a government that, through the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, has invested in the development of policies that focus on our children. They have been in the same ministry focusing on the expansion of the parental support programs, whether you are a single mother, whether you have a child that is in need of assistance, whatever your supporting mechanisms are, the minister and the ministry with responsibility for people empowerment, they have taken responsibility for making sure that there is a whole of country and a whole of government approach to parenting, to rearing children, and to making sure that the structures that support our systems are in place. The largest and the most I have had, Mr. President, over the course of this past year, I have led in my own ministry 2 amalgamations, I should say 1. An amalgamation of the energy company, which I've spoken about before. I've started Business Barbados, which is an amalgamation of what used to be Business Barbados and the business facilitation. But the largest amalgamation in this country's public sector, Mr. President, sits under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. And it is the amalgamation of all these social empowerment agencies, from Child Care Board to deal with children, from the Welfare Department to deal with those who need additional support, from elderly care to deal with those who are typically benefiting from home health services and all of that. This piece of legislation, Mr. President, that we're debating here today collides perfectly, even though it sits under the Ministry with responsibility for labor, it also fits neatly within the government's social policy framework. where this government is committed to investing in families. Now, Mr. President, there's a conversation also under this ministry about things like crime prevention and the need for us to make certain that we speak specifically into the lives of our young people starting in their homes. When children bond with parents, there is a moment that you will never forget when that child was born, when that child first looked at you, when that child reached every milestone. Those first few weeks are important. Those first few years are important. Those first few years help to socialize the adult or the young man that your child or young woman that your child will become. And the investment in keeping families in the homes with their children in those early days after they are born, and then supporting them with social care infrastructure so that they have the benefit of supporting mechanisms when the child is getting older. Those are key elements of this government's social care investment in our people. Those things matter to people, Mr. President. And so this legislation is critical. It is groundbreaking. It is going to have financial implications. Yes, of course it will. Now, does the government have all the resources to do all that you would want it to do? I am sure that fathers may want to be home for the full 12 weeks or the full 14 weeks that the mother may choose. But does the state at this time have the ability to match the investment made by the trillion-dollar developed economies of the world that offer that expansive? It may sound fanciful to say that, and if you haven't taken the time and applied the rigor of thought to assessing how it is costed, then you can say all kinds of wild things. Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we expand it this farther? Why is it only so little time? Because we have to start somewhere, but I have established, Mr. President, that where we are starting is ahead of every single Caribbean neighbor, almost every single developing neighbor, Mr. President, by including an extension for mothers and including a brand new provision for fathers. Governance, Mr. President, is about balance. It is about balancing all the competing obligations of the state. It is about ensuring that you are a first mover while still protecting the crease. It is making sure you play the shots while you don't leave your wicket exposed, Mr. President, if you want to use a cricketing analogy, and I'm not a cricketer. But it is about making sure, Mr. President, that while you play shots by leading with a paternity benefit and an extension of maternity benefits, Mr. President, in your insurable earnings and making sure you are covered, that you do not leave your social infrastructure, you do not leave your national insurance scheme, you do not leave your financial commitments exposed to the extent that you then cannot afford it to make it available to the persons who are there. And so, Mr. President, I did not want to spend an extended period of time on this legislation. I expect that there is going to be a debate, and so I've anticipated what some of those things are going to be, and since I have the advantage of having 2 bites at this cherry, there are some things that I expect that I will say in my wrap-up when I close on this particular bill. But, Mr. President, I want to stand in support of this bill. I want to stand in support of Barbados leading. I want to stand in support of fathers. I want to stand in support of mothers. I want to stand in support of responsible governance. I want to stand in support of financial responsibility. And I want to stand in support of the balance between governance, social, economic, and fiscal responsibility, Mr. President. And with these words, I want to beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as with Senator Cummings and yourself, I would like to join in extending congratulations to the Parliament for the hosting of the 68th CPA conference just last week here in Barbados, and also to yourself, Mr. President, and the Speaker in the other place for your leadership, having both served on the Executive Committee for the CPA for the planning of the conference. Mr. President, I was really hoping that Senator Cummings would give me a little bit more time And I'm hoping that it's not her intention to introduce new items